Hello. I'm recording this on the 12th of August 2026. Just for reference, outside just now, the moon passed over the sun. We just saw it at around 7 o'clock local time. I'm going to do a discussion, read out an article I wrote about John Locke, his metaphysics and his political theory. I'm just going to read it out straight. The way I approached it is I read the essay concerning human understanding. I began that in January of this year, reading it on and off. I then read the two treatises of civil government, the two treatises of government, over the last couple of months. Obviously, I've been reading other things. And I usually give myself a treat by then reading what after having written what I think, I then read what Bertrand Russell says he thinks in his History of Philosophy from the 1940s. So I'll talk about Bertrand Russell briefly at the end of this. I'll begin. My purpose here is to extract what I think are the important elements of Locke's philosophy and political theory for my own purposes. I'm writing a book about Britain and its troubles, and I have honed in on the fact that John Locke is kind of our first philosopher and probably the most important of the English-speaking philosophers. It was my experience of reading philosophy at university and over many years in my own time that Locke was not often referred to, and I was never tempted to read his work. This is due to the kind of studies which I myself used to carry out. But I have found that my copy of Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which back in the day I referred to as a guidebook for my own reading, and which is covered in my own annotations, has no marks or comments on the pages devoted to Locke, and Russell gives him 4 chapters, more or less. And I think that I avoided even reading what Russell had to say about him. If I'm entirely candid, I should say that I have read Locke in recent months after feeling sympathy for my own country in a way which I never used to, and because of the rumour that he wrote as a Christian. I've never before been tempted to read his work. Young people, such as I was, are more interested in foreign things and strange ideas, which, from what I could gather, I was not going to find in his work. But now that I find my country in serious trouble, and now that I've committed myself to membership of a church and to alliance with God with my limited means, I have had reason to find out what Britain's first truly important thinker has written. I do have the intention of explaining what he seems to me to have been intending to do, but I will not engage in this except to advise British and Christian people what they will find when reading him for themselves. What I mean is, I am making a general survey of his 2 most important books, and I do not intend to position myself in some kind of controversy, and I haven't read the scholarship surrounding his work. So I will not be attending to any specific point and arguing my case about how I see it, compared to and contrasted with the views of other people and their interpretations. I don't pay any attention to matters in his work unless they concern me and my project personally. I don't think Locke's philosophy deserves to constitute a school of philosophy to which I could belong. I say this after having read his work. He has no system. His work is, rather, the expression of what was quite commonly believed in his own day. It is the view of a man of the late 17th century. The view of a man who was there when Britain had its last revolution and its civil war at the time when this country was set up. So his work has more of a historical interest and a literary enjoyment for me. I must say that at this moment, as I begin, I want to turn immediately to his political work, namely the 2 treatises of government. For some reason, what he says there has a grip on my intellectual faculty which far outmatches the fascination that I have for his view of the human understanding. I suppose that this is easy to explain, since Locke obviously wrote that book in 4 parts on the human understanding in order to fight a battle which is now part of history and no longer has any meaning for us. Namely, he wrote against scholasticism and the schools. Perhaps the main animus driving him to compose those 4 books, which are collected as the Essay on Human Understanding, the animus driving him was the war of the English mind against the departing and European medieval world. Locke begins the work on human understanding by attacking the belief that human beings were born with ideas already in their minds. It's not so much that Locke is correct to attack this, which interests us, as that it was a cornerstone of scholastic thinking that people were born with ideas already loaded into their minds, and that his first intention was to disprove this. Also, from the first pages, it is apparent that Locke is writing in English, and that anyone who reads his philosophy, and usually does so in some kind of foreign language or translation, from the German, from the French, or Latin or Greek, he will find himself pleasantly surprised to have something in English. And I could also say written by an English type from the English culture, so that it is something in conversational and precise, steady and slow style. There's something about the English character which makes us write in a conversational style rather than a dogmatic style. That's what I'm trying to say here. His style is rather repetitive, and it does attempt to be comprehensive and to cover all angles of a problem he's discussing. So he makes a point, and he tends to exhaust all of the arguments in its favour, and also, at the same time, or usually afterwards, to answer responses which he might anticipate or imagine would be made to what he's written. As everyone knows, he asserted that all human knowledge has its origin in experience, since it cannot have been given to man at his birth. And his experience while he's living provides him alone with the secondary qualities of reality, the things of the senses, that is to say. The primary qualities of reality are forever hidden from him. This distinction is not useful, as is also widely known, because if a primary quality can never be known under any circumstances, then it is improper to call it a quality. Locke seems to have thought of primary qualities as those things which give what we can perceive motion, bulk, and so on, but that nothing more about them can be known. So you could say, we know the secondary qualities of things in reality and in the world because they're given to us by our senses, but the primary qualities of the things in the world and in reality are hidden from us, and they are obviously invisible things which we suppose to have bulk, motion, extension. I suppose that the distinction he was trying to make is this, that by contrast with the mind and the spirit, which make use of ideas and thought and sensations, there is a physical world of mere moving and bulky matter, a material mechanical world, and that we can't really have any direct access to this mechanical world. So he's setting up a contrast between the spiritual mental world, which we know and which we are, and the mechanical world, which is out there, which must be out there to form the world. It's the world's structure. But we, maybe because we are too high up and too intelligent, cannot directly experience this mechanical aspect. The principle of this distinction between primary and secondary qualities simply sets out that there are things of mere matter and there are things of pure spirit, and that we are kind of halfway between them, able to more towards the range or the spectrum of spirit rather than matter. He was more consistent when he said that anything which a man knows and understands is an idea in his mind, and his senses deliver these ideas to him. Locke makes a great deal of conclusions from this simple and true point, And the true point is that anything we can think about is a perception inside our mind and is therefore an idea. For instance, any substance, which is his word for composite items such as a person or a horse or a house, any substance or what we know to be complex objects in the world will be known only as a set of ideas. And the ideas we join together in our understanding so as to come to a picture of a composite item. But we can never actually know the true reality of that substance because we can't see the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of the object. We'll come to this later because it does have quite astonishing implications. As an example, we shall know perhaps an infinite number of things about gold, but gold in itself and in full will never be known by us. When I've been reading Locke, it has occurred to me to say something like this, that we know much more today about gold than he did in his time. And so in the 21st century, we can lay claim to knowing exactly what gold is. And that perhaps Locke's scientific interests, which taught him that we know very little about the world, have been more and more completed, and so that his skepticism about the nature of reality is no longer justified. This is something we could say, and it just frequently crosses your mind as you read Locke, that, yes, but we know more than you did. However, Locke's skepticism would still hold true today, as I will show later, and it would also do so in any future condition of knowledge. And I will now quote something in proof of this, of what he says. He says, "We are then quite out of the way when we think that certain things contain within themselves the qualities that appear to us in them. And we in vain search for that constitution within the body of a fly or an elephant upon which depend those qualities and powers that we observe in them. For which perhaps, to understand them aright, we ought to look not only beyond this our earth and atmosphere, but even beyond the sun, or the remotest star our eyes have not yet discovered. For how much the being and operation of particular substances, the fly or the elephant, in this our globe, depend on causes utterly beyond our view, is impossible for us to determine. We see and perceive some of the motions of grosser operations of things here about us. But whence the streams come that keep all those curious machines in motion and repair, how conveyed and modified, is beyond our notice and apprehension. And the great parts and wheels, as I may say of this stupendous structure of the universe, may, for aught we know, have such a connection and dependence in their influences and operations upon one another, that perhaps things in this our mansion would put on quite another face, and cease to be what they are, if some one of the stars or great bodies incomprehensibly remote from us should cease to be, or move as it does. This is certain, things, however absolute and entire they seem in themselves, are but retainers to other parts of nature, for that which they are most taken notice of by us. What he's trying to say here is something along the lines of the James Lovelock Gaia hypothesis, whereas James Lovelock actually tries to demonstrate that everything is interlinked. Locke is saying, for instance, if you think that you know what an elephant is, how do you know all of the different links that it has with everything else in the environment, even as far away as thousands and millions of miles away in space? There is no way of us knowing what effects the whole universe has on the smallest things, such as even a fly. And this is kind of what I mean when I say that the advances in modern science can never answer that question. And the amount of computation we would need to make to try to envisage things we just can't see would be almost infinite. This is the basis of his skepticism about the nature of reality. The part I've just quoted, it comes from book 4, chapter entitled Of Universal Propositions, Their Truth and Certainty, section 11. And there are pages and pages of this very extreme empirical skepticism or doubt which would make the typical arrogant scientific mind of our time the kind of person who says, trust the science, or I believe in the science. It would make such a person red in the face to hear what Locke has to say, with his doubts about the power of the human understanding to come truly to an understanding, a knowledge of what's going on, even in the smallest things of our world. I'm fascinated by how Locke was an acquaintance of Sir Isaac Newton, and it's quite amusing the way that Bertrand Russell says that Locke's reputation flourished because of his friendship with Isaac Newton. And they do have the same kind of spirit about them, the English scientist or natural scientist and the philosopher. What strikes the careful reader of Locke is that whether by design or unconsciously, he has made of the human subjective consciousness a timeless, eternal, immovable point. This is obviously something we do not find in Isaac Newton. For with this metaphysics of knowledge as mental idea, then the mind of the individual, namely every individual who is alive, becomes a sovereign point of isolated transcendence. And this has a bearing on his political philosophy as well, because his political philosophy, which we might call classical liberalism, starts from the fundamental unit of politics is the isolated individual, who is sovereign and free and transcendent. There is a rather subtle continuous circling around individual consciousness, and that individualistic Christian spirituality informing how Locke approaches knowledge and everything else. Whatever is known is always known by the Christian individual, who is alone in the world and limited and overseen by an omnipotent God. At the same time, and perhaps as a consequence, Locke considers reason to be the voice of God. And what Locke means by reason is that kind of thinking and activity which allows the individual to come to a compromise and a peaceful life with other people. Reason allows us to come to an agreement with other people, and this is one of its main qualities, if not its principal quality. And this is how we could say it is the voice of God, because it allows the sovereign individual free soul or person to live in harmony with other people. In the political work, he says that reason is well, let's leave it at that. Reason is a gift of God, and it's like a consistent law of God. So reason is that discursive power in us which can bring facts, experience, logic, and put them into words so that other people can consider them and be convinced by what we say, and vice versa. Locke could have asked why it is so that the mind has this central position. If he had asked why is the human consciousness at the centre of this inquiry into knowledge, it may be right to say that obviously, since we're looking after knowledge and understanding, then we have to concentrate on the human being who knows and understands. And the mind is the only thing which we can know. So you would certainly put it at the centre of any metaphysics or any philosophy, because it is the only site in which these things can take place. But I don't think that this would answer the question entirely, since it's not entirely proven that ideas are combined and exist in the mind, as he says that they are, by an individual. We shouldn't take it for, nobody takes it for granted that the individual is a sovereign centre of the entire world of knowledge. This is quite an unusual thing for somebody to say, in fact. Rather, I think it is because he had a Christian predisposition, and he located what matters about knowledge and activity in the free individual alone with himself, because this is the nature of the Christian religion. And the principle that there is a speculative world beyond our senses is also questionable. And that when he decided to think like this, he was making a distinction based, again, on his understanding that human beings are spiritual and they have an eternal soul. and that this must be separate from the mechanical world of the primary qualities, but to say that it is outside of our grasp to know the material world, this was something which is it's idiosyncratic to him. I mean to say that he has chosen to make the individual subjective mind into the sovereign centre of things. I find that this is also his approach to language and to the gathering of knowledge with other people. Knowledge is held by an individual, and the individual has the task of communicating properly with other people or not. And this is the reason that language and its use attracts his attention for the whole of one of the 4 books. It is, as it were, a situation where individual seekers after knowledge can do so alone, and usually do so alone. And they may face misunderstanding and contention if they meet with other people. But that the communal pursuit of truth is something which can be undertaken with the use of language. I fully understand that Ludwig Wittgenstein would disagree with this account of what language is and what human beings are when they use language in their thinking. But we're dealing with Locke, of course, and I have no time for Wittgenstein at this time. Locke is more likely to submit that men can never know the absolute reality of things, because he also implicitly and explicitly claims that men are created beings themselves who have been allotted a certain amount of power and knowledge and just enough understanding to get by in their lives as men. Men are the creation of God, and by nature they are confined by their created limits. Locke can show you that he could have seen things differently when he points out that there are things such as spirits and pure spirits and angels and so on. So he is putting a definite limit on what human beings can know, because he believes, he has investigated what we can know, and when he finds a limit, he accepts that it is a limit because he knows that there are higher spirits and purer beings who might pass beyond our knowledge. There are times in the book when one feels that if Locke had known about the periodic table, or DNA, or chemical bonding, and the like, then his claim that we cannot know the true nature of physical reality would have changed. He would have revised his thought about nature and reality had he known about the periodic table and electrical bonding, chemical bonding. For instance, if he were talking of gold, and asked the question which was not known in his time, why gold is not magnetic, and what precisely entirely distinguishes gold from other metals, somebody in our time could claim to know the answer. But I think that this additional knowledge of atomic bonding, which is known today, would not have changed Locke's mind, for it remains unknown to us why atomic bonding is taking place at all. And I say this as an aside. I was watching a short video of Richard Feynman the other day, one of the preeminent physicists of the 20th century, and somebody asked him what magnetism is. And he spent about 20 minutes discussing what it means when someone asks, what is something? There are questions which can have an answer, and there are questions which cannot have an answer. And Feynman said that the answer to what magnetism is does not have an answer. So again, if Locke were to have asked, why is gold not magnetic? And somebody put their hand up and said that today we can explain this, Feynman has said, no, we still don't know and we never will, which is precisely Locke's point. It is as if only God knows why the world is and what it is for. And as in my long quotation above, which is preceded and followed by comprehensive and touchingly thorough, attractively candid exposition, as in that quotation, we see that the universe is apparently infinite, and there are influences taking place in it which could be crucial to the existence of any single item about which we have not the remotest idea. I think it's commonly thought that Locke was religious only in a formal sense. That is, his contemporaries were beginning to become deists, and that they held a theory that God had created the world and then stood aside from it. This view is an obvious direct contradiction to the Old and New Testaments, of course, and Christianity in its real, genuine form, in which it is said that God interacts with human beings, is not deism. And I think that Locke was not a deist. By his references to the angelic spirits, and by the theory that man was a special creation at the centre of all experience, he has eschewed all theories of a clockwork universe without God's involvement, which the deists espoused. He believed that the mind and the freedom of action of the mind and the human soul does affect what goes on in the world at large, although he points out that how this happens remains, and probably forever will be, a mystery. I mean to say, I'll quote Locke now, but what he is saying is, nobody knows how thoughts can make matter move, and how matter can affect thoughts. It does happen, because we see it all of the time in our lives, but how it happens is a mystery. And it still is in our day, of course. Despite things like brain theory and the theory of brain consciousness, whatever they come up with these days. How any thought should produce emotion in the body is as remote from the nature of our ideas as how any body should produce any thought in the mind. That it is so, if experience did not convince us, the consideration of things themselves would never be able in the least to discover to us. We are prevented from understanding how a physical brain can give rise to immaterial thoughts, and how immaterial thoughts can move hands and move the body and so on. It is true, however, that Locke does refer twice in his work to the possibility of a science of morals, and I take a dim view of this really, because it was the pursuit continued by Jeremy Bentham, who was a bit of a psychopath in his approach to human life, and had no understanding of the human spirit as something free at all. He does refer twice in his work to the possibility of a science of morals by which men would know in a practical way how to achieve good rather than evil actions. He envisaged or imagined a calculus where it would be possible for a human being to calculate the good behaviour rather than the bad, and therefore be unable to do bad actions. This gives us the impression that he had in mind some supersession of religious belief by some kind of calculus of robotic human behaviour. I think that this same calculus has been a temptation of English thinkers ever since. Otherwise, Locke has very little interest in moral matters, in my opinion. What is good, he says, is what pleases us. And what pleases us depends on the amount of thought and discipline we put into being pleased by worthwhile and God-pleasing things. So you could say, and one of the aspects of being doing good things is being prudent. But alongside prudence, I think that there has to be a building of the character into the kind of person who would do good things by instinct and find pleasure in the things which are not intrinsically quickly enjoyable. I think that Locke's view of morality was that you should just be a good person by trying to be good over your life, and gradually you will become better. And the things which you enjoy will become more refined. And all of this is done because, he says, we are probationers on this world in order to enter the next world in the afterlife. We must, that is, study the scriptures to know what is right for men, and then cultivate those things in ourselves, the correct feelings and character which will find happiness in those things. Locke seems to imply that it would be a good thing if people were educated to enjoy what the scriptures say is good. But don't forget that he had this, and he only mentions it briefly, this idea of a science of happiness, which would mean a science of morality, which could be proven with mathematical and physical demonstrations. To conclude, I've already spoken or referred to Locke's theory of the self as the central point of all of his interests. I do not want to belabor this point. What I have said in this short essay can be summarized by what Locke himself has listed as the three types of certainty that the human understanding can attain to. And it does return us back to the centrality of the human subject and his consciousness. Now, atheists and those who want to deny our philosopher was a true Christian ought to be disappointed by what he says about the three types of more or less certain knowledge which we can have, because they are graded. The most certain thing is that we are conscious and alive. The second most certain thing can be arrived at by deduction, which is the existence of God. And then finally, we have the facts of natural science and empirical inquiry, which are subject more to probability than certainty. But I've gone off track here. I'll just go back to my text. In a very concise, almost absent-minded summary of his entire work, delivered without any great fanfare, Locke itemizes the things which we may know and how we may know them in Book 4, Chapter 3. He says that the only thing about which we may be absolutely certain is that one is oneself alive. This alone is known with absolute certainty. The immediate self-presence of a man to himself. Slightly lower down in terms of certainty is the certainty that God exists as a conscious, intelligent being. Locke says that it is logically necessary that God exists, and that he exists as an intelligent being or a person. The proofs for this are by deduction from various other basic facts. Because since I'm alive, then I must have been created. And since I've been created intelligent, then the Creator himself must be intelligent. And we can also gather that his personality is somewhat similar to our own. The final level of certainty consists of the ideas derived from experience, connecting which into a picture of reality must always be subject to doubt, and can only at best be said to give us an incomplete knowledge. And this is the sphere of the natural sciences and of our interaction with the empirical world. This realm of knowledge is always only probable and requires our assent rather than our conviction. And our assent can only be in degree. I add that Locke also does not discount the possibility of direct communication with God via enthusiasm, to which he devotes a chapter of the fourth book. But this is naturally to be controlled or impartially adjudicated by reason. When he uses the word enthusiasm, he means the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which was, I imagine, somewhat common in those days of Calvinism and the origin of evangelical sects. And Locke does not deny that enthusiasm may be possible, but that whatever it is that these people believe that they have received from God should be impartially adjudicated by the powers of reason, which is, we have to imagine ourselves as someone else and what this other person would think. And nobody should go into the public square and tell the world what is true merely by virtue of a message that they believe they've had from God. I suppose it would be possible to claim that if God speaks to a man, then he is given the highest possible sort of truth which ever will be available to us. And yet, since there is no way of verifying that it was God who spoke to the man, then any such communication of the enthusiastic type must always be accompanied by reason if they are brought into the public square. I conclude with a quotation which summarizes his approach to knowledge, the knowledge which can belong to men according to human understanding. He says, "Therefore, as God has set some things in broad daylight, as he has given us some certain knowledge, though limited to a few things in comparison probably, as a taste of what intellectual creatures are capable of, he has done so to excite in us a desire and endeavour after a better state. So, in the greatest part of our concernment, he has afforded us only the twilight, as I may say, of probability, suitable, I presume, to that state of mediocrity and probationership he has been pleased to place on us here. wherein to check our overconfidence and to check our presumption, we might, by every day's experience, be made sensible of our short-sightedness and our liableness to error. The sense whereof might be a constant admonition to us to spend the days of our pilgrimage in industry and care, in the search and following of that way which might lead us to a state of greater perfection. It being highly rational to think, even were revelation silent in this case, that as men employ those talents God has given them here, they shall accordingly receive their rewards at the close of day, when their sun shall set, and night shall put an end to their labours. That's from Book 4, Chapter 14, Section 2. I would also finish this part of my brief account of Locke by adverting to the easy, slow, friendly and soothing way in which Locke wrote. His style, which I have already tried to describe, is the work of a man who is gentle, careful not to offend, and he wants to gather your agreement, by which I mean he has manners and is polite. It is a sociable style, expressing the personality of a man who means well and who wishes to convince you by giving arguments. And finally, notice how he frequently asks the reader to supply his own objections and arguments, if he can. Indeed, I think that Locke revised his essay on human understanding, and as it went through its editions, he revised it following the suggestions and arguments from readers, expanding its size because it is quite a large book. That it is not systematic but rather piecemeal and sprawling, heading off in all kinds of directions, is something which Locke probably thought was a virtue, because systematic and dogmatic thinking were precisely those things in the scholastics which he wished to avoid. The essay was published in 1689, and in the same year the two Treatises of Government was also published, to which I will now turn, the second part of my essay. I have no great or encyclopedic knowledge of English history and British history, but I note in the preface written for the publication of the essay by Penguin, I notice something which is significant and obvious about the two treatises and about Locke's political views. He was in favour of the overthrow of the House of Stuart, who were the monarchs for most of his life, and the overthrow did occur in 1688. His early patron, after he had left teaching at the university, was the Earl of Shaftesbury, a man who was exiled in 1683 after having been discovered planning a coup against the Stuart monarchs. And the coup was meant to stop the accession of James II, who was a Catholic. So Locke's patron, the Earl of Shaftesbury, was exiled in 5 or 6 years before the Glorious Revolution because he had been plotting to remove the Stuarts from the throne, and Locke went into exile with him. And this is, in part, what dominates Locke's interest in the theory of knowledge, namely, to prevent scholastic and Catholic forms of knowledge from being taught at the universities and in other places. And it's clearly on his mind in the two political treatises concerned with proper government. I should point out from the start what my question is about Locke's political work and what I expected to find, and then here at the start what I do in fact find. I had expected to read the basis for political liberty in England and some kind of laborious effort to explain the ancient constitutional arrangements, which would describe them in terms which, I imagined, Locke would give the name of liberalism. And it has been my understanding that Locke is the father of classical liberalism. But there's none of that. Locke does not give excuses in a kind of argumentative way in which Edmund Burke does for conservatism. Rather, Locke comes up with a theory about human nature and the best way, or rather what he calls the civic way of living in a under a government. So you would say that Locke is writing a utopia, but a utopia in the British sense, which is based on some kind of empirical evidence. And the utopian government, the best government under which free men should live, happens to be the British Constitution after the Glorious Revolution. So it's a kind of description of the English Constitution mixed in with a theory of human nature and the fundamental needs of human beings. The first treatise was written, I think, some 10 or 20 years prior to the second. It has the same quality as the Essay on Human Understanding because it basically exhausts every possible way of thinking about a simple proposition, which was made by, and this proposition was made by a certain Richard Filmer, whose work was, at that time, very popular because it supported the Stuart monarchs, and with which Locke took very serious issue. Filmer had claimed in various places that absolute monarchy was justified and that it was the only proper government for a land, in this case England, because absolute monarchy is God's will. And Locke's treatise proves that absolute monarchy is not God's will. What interest can be found in this first part, in this first treatise? What interest can be found is the variety of ways in which Locke mocks this idea and mocks the author. He does so in a kind of a humorous and at the same time in a laborious, with great attention to detail, a laborious way. He goes to great length to discover what proofs there are for the notion that God designed mankind to be ruled by a hereditary king, and then to show that these arguments, which can be put in favour of monarchy, absolute monarchy, are not sufficient. In brief, Filmer's arguments are neither good nor even very clear, and his chief piece of evidence that the monarch must rule unimpeded is that Adam was created alone and that God gave Adam alone possession of all creation. From this we are to deduce that a single monarch must rule all of creation in our time. This is obviously not a good foundation for a political theory of government, and Locke exhausts more or less every way that is possible to refute the idea that there must be a single monarch ruling all of creation. There is a part of the first treatise where Locke breaks away from the demolition work and provides us with what he sees as a more sane account of the reason for government and what it should look like. And I will quote this breakout of Locke's own views on the matter from the first treatise, because they prefigure the second, which was written years later, and they concisely put in a few sentences what the second treatise is all about. He says, "For the strong desire of preserving his life and being, having been planted in man as a principal action by God himself, reason, which was the voice of God in him, could not but teach him and assure him that pursuing that natural inclination he had to preserve his being, he was following the will of his Maker. And therefore he had the right to make use of those creatures which, by his reason or senses, he could discover would be serviceable thereunto. And thus man's property in the creatures was founded upon the right he had to make use of those things that are necessary or useful to his being." I know it could be quite hard to follow a straightforward quotation. What he's saying here is that man has been made by God to have a self-preservation instinct. And the voice of self-preservation in a man is the law and the word of God. The voice of God is in him, telling him to stay alive. And that when a man finds property around him, other creatures and so on and so forth, that he can make use of to preserve his life, then those are to be thought of as his property, which he is entitled to by the blessing of God. Here's another quotation. "The first and strongest desire that God planted in men and wrought into the very principles of his nature, being that of self-preservation, and self-preservation is the foundation of a right to the creatures. for the particular support and use of each individual person by himself. But next to this, God planted in men a strong desire also of propagating his kind and continuing himself in his posterity. And this gives children a title to a share in the property of their parents and a right to inherit their possessions. This is the justification for inheritance, because Locke does not exactly find any justification for inherited monarchy, an absolute monarchy, in Genesis, but he does believe in inheritance of property. These brief statements of a position on his fundamental beliefs are short and only taken up again if they're a kind of brief interlude between the colossal boredom of the first treatise. But they are taken up again in the second treatise. Filmer had offended Locke so deeply because the argument of Filmer's book was to prove that kings rule by divine right and that all men are slaves to the king. And this had been said so as to justify the Stuart monarchs and to prevent any further civil wars against them. What is remarkable about the second treatise is the fundamental importance which Locke gives, with relatively little justification, for the theory that all law and thus all government derives from the imperative that an individual's property must be protected. There are justifiable reasons for this theory of property, namely that if a man does not have any property, then he will die. But the incredible importance of these two principles, namely self-preservation and property ownership, probably seems to me to have demanded a bit more explanation and introduction. What is novel in our minds is that property is more important as a concept to Locke than life. For the law of nature, as Locke understands it, requires that a man preserve his life and protect himself with the use of property. And the reason why property can be said to be more important than life is that sometimes men risk their lives to gain property. But he has no choice about this, because a man is not the ultimate owner of his life. Rather, his life is ultimately God's property, which again reinforces this almost divine quality of property ownership. Because man himself is a property of God. And in this way, property is metaphysically the notion which underpins everything else, including the state as a whole, which we'll come to see. One must survive in order to obey the voice of God and the commands of reason, and not for the sake of life itself. Rather, staying alive and self-preservation is a divine command issued by God as the fundamental law of nature, because we are the creation and property of God. Further, notice how Locke has presented the reader with law as something which exists beyond man and his own ideas of himself. The law is something he lives under from the moment of his birth, and it is the law which he knows by use of his reason. That is, his reason tells him to survive. We'll find out later that Bertrand Russell was confused by the simplicity and brutality of the situation and the description of mankind which Locke has in mind when he says law. Mankind lives under one law only in the state of nature, and that is that he must survive. And everything else comes from this. I think that Russell probably didn't understand how brutally basic Locke was about the drive to exist, to survive. And when Locke talks about the laws of nature, this is the only thing he's talking about. As with the metaphysics of knowledge and reality, the individual is therefore the principal rule against which everything else is to be understood, because it's only the individual who obeys the law of nature and must survive. So by virtue of his creation as a man, created by God, the first unit of measurement and understanding in politics is the individual. The individual belongs to God, and the law is on the individual, and the law is something he must obey and therefore survive. Secondly, he will do so by gathering property from the creatures which are around him and available in the form of food, land, and so on. And land and property also include, the notion of land and property also includes that form of them which is imperishable, namely money. It is briefly explained that if a man gives rise to children, then it is his responsibility to raise them and to tend to them by sharing with them his property. And that if he should die, then the property which he has gained and raised his children in should be, by force of nature, passed on to the children, since this is fair and just. The principle is that they have been raised from birth to expect a certain kind of life while their father was alive, and that now he is dead, they should continue to expect the same kind of life. And so they inherit all of his property. Locke calls this situation where a man is bound by law to survive and to gather property to such an extent that he can survive, he calls this the reign of the law of nature. It is the state of nature. And in that state, if any man or any other man attempts to take his property and thereby endanger his survival, then the individual has no other means of defending his property or to defend the life which God has given him other than to murder the thief. Locke is again quite brutal about this. The law of nature is simple. You must survive. And God has given this imperative to man. He's a creature made by God, and he's the property of God. And it's his duty to survive. To survive, he must gain property. And if somebody else tries to take the property from him, then he must murder the thief. Because in a state of nature, let's say he has no money, only his food for tomorrow and the day after. The loss of the food for tomorrow and the day after by a thief would be his death sentence. And therefore he is entitled to murder anyone who tries to steal from him. The urgency of this demand to kill the thief can be understood when we call to mind that in a state of nature, a man is alone. He cannot call for help from anyone else, so that if, for example, he loses the food for the day, then he will go hungry for that day, and that if this continues for 2 or so weeks, he will certainly die. Again, the principle that a man is entitled by God to murder other people in a state of nature depends on the notion that he is alone. A state of nature is the state of the solitary. Whether this is the real state of nature or whether it is the law that is given by God, and whether men really are isolated individuals at any time, or whether reason is the law of God speaking to a man, are questions which Locke has no interest in examining. Like Filmer, he starts, apparently, from the condition of man as described in Genesis. And examining the behaviour of the Jews through the Old Testament, one must conclude that preservation and survival are what God wants above all from men. Describing man as an individual first and foremost, who is only bound by nature, survival and the rules of property, with the inherent power and even the demand that he kill his enemies, and with an obligation to look after his children, this is a simple and drastic theory of what a man is, and what his existential situation in life is. We can see that this is the condition describing the life of, let's say, Abraham or Jacob. In this scheme, Locke accounts for marriage, because again, we're dealing with individuals, so why should there be any marriage? Locke accounts for marriage as the means of procreating and continuing the race, which you could say God also wants. And with a wry sense of scientific observation, lying entirely outside of the etiquette and ideas of his time, he says that man is unusual in nature among other animals in being monogamous. Human beings in a state of nature are generally monogamous, and they are unusual amongst other animals in that they live indefinitely together in a marriage. And the reason for this, he says, is because the human young take such a long time to develop, such a long time that they need almost an entire life of care and the cooperation of both parents. And this is the reason for monogamy and marriage. It's an indication of the place which loyalty to the state must play in this scheme of extreme individualism that Locke also says that a child does not become an adult or a citizen until he is 21, and this is because a person under the age of 21 is not yet capable of understanding the need for loyalty and what it is that he must commit himself to in a society until that age of 21. Until that time, the child must be loyal only to his family, his parents. I do not think that Locke greatly emphasises the importance of the idea of loyalty, but the loyalty seems to me to be the actual crossover point from the state of nature to the state of civil society. And I mean loyalty to the state. Loyalty as an oath to the community that he's joining. But I'll come to this later. Certainly, there's no idea here of the state having any responsibility for the child. This is the kind of thing which we imagine nowadays, where the politicians almost instinctively start to grasp of their rights over other people's children. In the state of nature, the only responsibility for children is the parent, and even in the civil society of which Locke now describes, children are the sole responsibility until the age of 21 of the parents. And this it's quite crucial that what changes a child into an adult is the turning of the age of 21 and the ability to pledge himself loyally to the state rather than to his family. But I will return to loyalty, which seems to be what behind all of this holds such a society together. I'll return to it. I just quote Locke here: "A child is born a subject of no country or government," from section 118 of the second treatise. But when he reaches the age of discretion, he must pledge himself in loyalty to a certain society, whether it is England or any other. I don't think it would be allowed in his time for somebody to say, "I belong to no country but to my parents," once he'd passed the age of 21. By that time, they've become responsible for themselves. I would point out here as soon as possible the rather rare idea that it is because a man is intrinsically an individual with responsibility for himself and his eternal life, and that he is free, and that the state of late nature is a lonely one. It's because of this that the change which takes place when he joins a society is one of strict loyalty to that society, because it is so easy for someone to fall back into a state of nature and isolation that the betrayal of the community would be almost a certainty for most people, for all of us, if we had not, that is, given an oath or a promise of dedication and loyalty to the government and the nation which he chooses to join. It's a growing interest of mine at this time, as we look at the troubles of our country and the way it's falling apart, and we try to work out who is British and who isn't. It seems to me that the one distinctive feature of being British rather than something else is that you can swear loyalty to this country and to no other. Many of the people who are foreign to our country are unable to do this, and this rather than, let's say, their race or their religion, this alone is sufficient for us to find out who belongs in Britain and who doesn't. And Locke is quite strict about it too, that the promise or the oath of allegiance which people take, whether vocally or implicitly by living in Britain as British people, this is an unbreakable vow, and the only way that you can leave that loyalty is by being a traitor, in which case you're the enemy of a country and you're at war with it, or if the state itself is dissolved. I'll come to this later, but this gives Locke a conclusion which he is very happy to indulge in, which is that if a state to which the British people have pledged their oath of allegiance and the promise of everlasting loyalty, if that state then becomes their enemy, then it's the duty of the people of Britain to dissolve the government and overthrow it violently, and which, as we know, happened in the 1640s and in the year before this book was published. So this is a very real threat which governments and societies face, and they have to face it, according to Locke. In a time when ethno-nationalism and civic nationalism are in debate, It's something to see what Locke has to say. A child, he says, when he breaks free of his parents, must choose his country. But if he lives in a country having not been born there, he remains a foreigner until he does pledge allegiance and forsakes any other country. So, he says, and thus we see that foreigners, by living all their lives under another government and enjoying the privileges and protection of that other government, though they are bound even in conscience to submit to its administration, as far forth as any denizen, yet they do not thereby become to be subjects or members of that commonwealth. Nothing can make any man a member of that commonwealth, but is actually entering into it by positive engagement and express promise and compact. That is, which I think, that is it. That is that which I think concerning the beginning of political societies, and that consent which makes any one a member of any commonwealth. The express promise and compact has to be made by a foreigner before they can become a member of the commonwealth, the country in question. This idea of the promise, which must be made by a citizen of any given nation, is an act, a declaration of loyalty, which could be said rarely to take place in our country. As an example, you would ask, precisely when do British people swear or promise to belong to the nation, forsaking all others? And the answer is, I suppose, they do so perpetually. People who were born in a country and do not leave it and continue to live there renew their oath automatically and prove it by the way they act toward the nation and towards each other. They do so, I think, if Locke is right, often without knowing the obligation that they are under. And I would say that it is precisely because it is not widely known that loyalty among the people is absolutely necessary that it has become almost comically easy to bring among the British vast quantities of foreigners who are not remotely loyal and, as time passes, become more and more dangerous to the survival of our nation and government. But in simple terms, nature and God has made us into individuals. And if we are to form a civil government, then each individual compromises himself and gives up his individual identity, replacing it with a national identity. So the individuals in a state of nature, who are all isolated and following the law of nature, they give up their individual identity and they stop following the law of nature in order to embrace national identity. And this change and relation to the nation is the act of loyalty. A half-hearted relationship to the nation is a kind of treason and should be punished, since it leads to the dissolution of the government. I suppose I would call this a theory of human life, a pure individualism. On this basis, there does not seem to be any need for civic society, and that civil government is something people freely choose or reject. But the natural state of men is that they have no civil government, as we know. And I would say that a state populated by people without loyalty, such as ours might well be at this time in 2026, that state is in a state of nature without knowing, because without loyalty to the state, the people in it are only half members of it, which means that they have fallen back, inadvertently no doubt, into a state of nature, where self-preservation alone matters, where the individual is not bound by anything to the people around him, and in the worst cases where the law has to be sorted out by direct confrontation between enemies until one of them dies. Locke does not make many references to the West Indies and the colonies in the Americas, but both in the essay and the treatise, both of them show that that he is aware of the nature of what was going on in the form of settlement, colonies, and the behaviour of natives found there. And I would make a reference now, because we're still on the subject of the state of nature now. And I'd like to make a side reference to another work I've come across recently by David Graeber, who died a couple of years ago. And his last published work was called The Dawn of Everything. And it's about what the state of nature, so-called, really was like before the rise of farming and before the Western society, the shape of society with which we are familiar. And he makes a striking claim in the first pages of that book, which is typically both true and also quite shocking and outside the scholarship and understanding of history, which is mainstream. He says that the interaction between these non-European American native Indians, when the Westerners found these Indians, the meeting affected and contributed to the development of the European Enlightenment. And Graeber might say that the Americas and the meeting of the Westerners, explorers, and the Indians had an effect on Locke himself. Well, Locke certainly did know about the Americas. Travels around the world and awareness of other ways of life had begun to affect and alter how men in London viewed their own society and their form of government. And Graeber's thesis is that perhaps the idea of the individual, the notion of individual freedom, became so important to men like Locke because it was so strongly evidenced in the Americas, where you can find the idea of the noble savage, for example, in Rousseau. The idea of the solitary noble savage was very, very important in Western development of the Enlightenment. Perhaps the American Indians taught the Europeans the nobility of the individual as a concept, and as a unit of value in the political state. However, perhaps I misread Graeber when I read this, because it is ridiculous to claim that individualism has its origin in the memoirs of colonial travellers who came back from the Americas back to Europe, when we reflect that Christ was the supreme individual, and he is the supreme human individual. And the Italian Renaissance, which derived from studies of Roman law and Greek culture, valorized individuality and freedom long before the discovery of the Americas. The individual was a legal concept in Roman law. So we had, and it carried straight through to the Western civilization which developed during the medieval period and so on. Individualism is not something which was discovered at the time of John Locke. What Graeber was interested in saying, I think, rather relates to the idea that those Americans showed Europeans the captivating idea of freedom and equality, which could be found when nobody owned any property. Now, this is something directly in opposition to Locke's view, because there were certain tribes, Graeber shows us, in the Americas, which eschewed any property whatsoever. And they were hunter-gatherers at periods, and then they went to certain camps and worked together at other periods. It's an interesting book by Graeber. But I think that all that the Americans could have shown Europeans was a life lived without property and how it can survive. Men in a state of nature, Locke says, are equal, in that each of them has only one command, namely to survive, and each of them is equally entitled to survive. But that they are equal in their property and in their activity is clearly untrue. And it is the notion of equality which probably did come from the Americas and did affect the French and the English quite powerfully, because they began to imagine a world in which nobody owned anything and everyone was equal in being equally poor or equally free. Graeber himself later shows us that there were plenty of slave-owning societies in North America. And he also shows us the advanced state of those societies, which, even though they fell quickly before the advance of the Western colonizers, they were not primitive. They had advanced societies. They were simply unable to defend themselves against the Westerners. That was the problem. I would interpret Locke to mean that God owns each man, but that each man owns his property as a result of his labour. And since men are different one from another, then their property will never be equal or the same, but it will vary. And if they don't have property, then they'll die. Hence, inequality of property is essential to survival, and it is the natural law that there will be inequality. At the end of my essay, I do want to mention Bertrand Russell again, who, in the 1940s, I'm distressed to say, was advocating a society without property ownership. He was also advocating a society without nations, which is both both of these principles are entirely contrary to the classical liberalism. So I don't know what Bertrand Russell was playing at. It appears to me he was dabbling with a kind of soft English form of communism. But in Locke's time, particularly in Rousseau, and in many others in France, among men who had made the revolution more likely, equality and property, or the idea that property is not needed, came to seem as the original situation of men. The propertyless man came to seem to them to be the state of nature. It became a commonplace around this time that before the advent of civilization, all men were equally rich and equally poor in that they did not own anything. Now in Locke, from the first, as we've seen, in the origin story of the state, which for him, the origin story of the state is a fictional event which is outlined in his book. But the origin story of human life is in Genesis, in which we find that man was entitled to work the land and to claim the work as his own. So from the start, men have property. As he points out in proof of the notion that once a man has worked the land, then it is his own, he goes so far as to point out that uncultivated land in the Americas is literally worthless. You can buy thousands of miles of American land for practically nothing, because wilderness, which is unworked by human hands, has no value whatsoever. While cultivated land, which can produce food or herds, has a value and must be considered to be the property of the man who worked on it and brought it into to have a value. Basically, when a man works, Locke says, he gains property and the means to survive, and he is entitled to defend that property against anyone else who wants to take it from him. As we've seen, in a state of nature, to the death. In a similar spirit, expanding this practical idea of property ownership, Locke says that in a state of nature, when a man is in danger of dying and prefers to live, then by becoming beholden to another man for his food and work, in this way, by choosing to live rather than to die, and choosing to rely on another man for his survival, he becomes the slave of that land, of that other man. And this is the origin of slavery. It's later on a major principle which is called on when discussing revolution, when he says that men can never voluntarily give themselves up to slavery and remain part of a civil society. If a man is in a position where he has to give himself up to slavery in order to survive, which of course is to fulfill God's commands, but he becomes a slave, he is not living in a civil society, he is living in a state of nature, or rather of war, where we'll come to the state of war. The distinction between state of nature and war is quite blurred, really. The state of war is kind of the natural relationship between men in a state of nature. And I think that when early in the work Locke says that some men have made themselves slaves rather than die, he is referring there to men who cannot be members of the society or government. They are without property, and they have fallen below the level for being considered anything but men in a state of nature, and they cannot be thought of as taking part in civil life. Although they do take part in the natural condition of a relationship with God, and this is in the nature of things, it is the state of nature. So people who are poor and who are what you might say the peasants of the Middle Ages, I mean, I'm not very conversant with how they lived, but people who say, for example, the serfs of Russia, those people are slaves and they live in a state of nature and they are not part of civil society. I suppose that Locke would say that a slave does have other options if he does not like his slavery. He can escape and find his own land and work it for himself. Or, being in a state of nature as he is, he can attempt to kill his master, which would be his right to try to do so. But the proper form of slavery has taken place during war and after the war, when a fight for resources and property has been engaged in. When somebody has fought in a war against an enemy and the enemy wins, the enemy has the right to kill him. And a deal can be struck whereby the defeated person begs for his life and is given it on condition that he become a slave. This is probably one of the origin stories of most civil societies. somebody ceases to be a slave when they can make an oath of loyalty, as a free man, to a civil society, which is what happened gradually after the last conquest of England, which was in 1066, as everyone knows. Slowly, over many decades, the slaves of England, which was basically anyone who wasn't Norman, gradually were given the right to declare allegiance to the king, and they became citizens of a civil government. But prior to that, prior to the emergence of the civil government, they were in a state of nature. The origin of civil society, which takes up roughly the second part of the treatise, discusses how men come to form such a society and the role of the government. By Locke's theory, which is intended to be a description of civil government as he found it in England, civil government is a single step away from the state of nature. And the step from nature to civil society is performed by an act of voluntary loyalty to a greater society, and by submission not to the law of nature but to human law. This is done in one single leap. Civil society differs from the state of nature in this alone, that the members have voluntarily and indefinitely, in every one of the members, submitted to rule by a government. Their property remains their own, and this is why they join the civil society, because their property will be protected by the other members of the government, of the society, including their life. And it is protected by an impersonal rule of law, which the members of the society craft together and legislate, rather than by the direct law of nature, which is retributive and can lead to continuous war and eventual sudden death. So, preferring to protect their property by joining a society, rather than protecting it by having periodically to be killed or to murder people, this is the deal which is made. In effect, when a thief attacks the property of a man in the state of nature, he has to directly carry out retribution on him. But when a thief attacks the property of man in a civil society, then the government forces will kill or punish the offender on behalf of the victim. And as we've said, in a state of nature, a man has to do it for himself. And a civil society is preferable to a state of nature for this reason only, that when once a cycle of violence has begun, as in the trilogy of Aeschylus, the Agamemnon, the Orestes and the Eumenides, the killings just carry on, revenge after revenge, until a point is reached where the violence can stop by the intervention of a third party. And this is the part played by the civil government. So Locke proposes that the endless cycle of murder for the sake of property or some other cause comes to an end and never needs to be revived when a civil government is formed. So civil government is preferable because it puts an end to perpetual violence, and yet the members of the society retain the same basic character, and property always belongs to the individual, and the individual is bound by law to defend his property. And don't forget that this law to defend his property and gather it is given to him by the voice of God and the law of nature, which says, survive, you must survive. That voice still applies in a civil society, but the defence of your property and the defence of your right to life is now guaranteed by the government. The ideal form of society has an executive, and we're talking now the type of society which alone a man should volunteer himself to join should have an executive, namely a kind of king or a prime minister. It should have a legislative, which should consist of members of the society, by which he means a parliament, and it should also consist of the major property owners, who should keep the society on the right track, because property is the main focus of the society, of course. The hierarchy is actually king, then landowners, and then legislative commoners. Locke concludes his book after showing the narrow gap which remains between nature and civil society by showing the various ways in which it can fail to be civil. and which is a constant prospect for all of the members who are part of a civil society. The constant prospect is that the deal they struck by being loyal to the government and to their society is a bad deal. And this becomes the case where a usurper arises. Somebody who's in a society ruled by a usurper, his property is not going to be in safe hands. Also, societies can degenerate into a tyranny, where a single man, who pays no heed to the people who are the members of the society, a single man does what he wants. He is both the legislative, making the laws, and also the executive, carrying out the directions of those laws. Also, in the case, Locke also wants to consider extreme cases of where societies seem they might break, and they break their own rules, but they don't, because they are permitted extreme instances of arbitrary behaviour amongst the executive, such as during a war with another society, when the executive cannot wait for a new law in order to gather money or gather men to attack. He must simply do it for the immediate benefit of the community. And finally, there are situations in which it is necessary to dissolve the government forcibly, or in other words, there are situations when it's necessary by the law of reason to disband and destroy the civil government. Civil war or rebellion is necessary above all when the government has made the citizens into slaves. That is, where the people have no representation and they are, as in a state of nature, looking after themselves without being able to call on the help of the civil government. And we would imagine that in a situation where they've been turned into slaves, their property is being freely and arbitrarily taken from them by collusion between the legislative and the executive. It's quite something which is drastically obvious to people who live in 2026. But it was also apparent to Russell, who was quite perceptive about his government in 1944, that in Britain there is no real distinction between the legislature and the executive. So if a party takes control of a country, such as the Labour Party, and it's a small faction, once they've become the legislative, they also have control over the executive, and they can pass all kinds of laws which allow them to exploit and damage the people and take their property without any resistance. That was happening, and that already happened to, I don't know whether you'd call them beneficent effects in 1944. And by 1945, the Labour Party was changing the country with relatively little opposition, either inside or outside the party. That it has been happening in the Tory Party and the Labour Party and any other possible party, but in the last 10 years, has not quite been so positive. And there hasn't been any recourse of the people to stop the executive from just simply doing what it wants. For instance, holding open the borders, shutting the country down, and so on. There is one justification for destroying the government, which is that it no longer serves to protect the property of the members. When the government no longer allows individuals the freedom to enjoy their own property, and it no longer protects that property impartially, then the members of the community are fully justified. In fact, they are duty-bound to dissolve that government. Because it already is in a state of nature. When a sufficiently large number of people is aware that by malice or incompetence, the lawmakers are making laws which contradict the laws of nature, contradict the voice of God, and which endanger their property and their survival, then they will inevitably break the government up, which is what happened more than a couple of times in the 1600s in England. I suppose there is something missing from this account, which is to mention what, to Locke, is central to the civil government. Namely, that for the sake of protecting the property of individual members of the society, the highest power in the land is the law. The highest power in the land is the law which controls everybody who lives there, including the king and the prime minister and so on. And this setup, which is the law is made by the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarch. Locke calls this tripartite setup the legislative because all three of them make the laws. Any new act has to be signed off by the king, has to be made by the Commons, and has to be approved by the Lords. In England, the monarch also happens to be part of the legislature, but only as a final approval. But he also is the executive, so that within the law he can do what he likes. This is obviously no longer the case today. In our time, the Prime Minister has that position. The legislative must be made up of representatives from the individuals who form the society, and this is the place of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In this way, just as an individual in a state of nature is governed by the law of nature, so in a civil society he is willingly governed and submits to be governed by and is loyal to the laws issued by the legislative. You could say that this is why we swear an oath of allegiance to the monarch and to the government, and in the oath of allegiance. And the executive, who carries out the instructions of the law, is similarly bound. And there ought to be, as I've just said, a division between the king and the people who draft and approve those laws. There are exceptions, such as times of war, when the executive can act arbitrarily, but if either the executive or the legislative act in such a way as to endanger or willfully betray the people and the community, then the government must be dissolved, which is Locke's word for it must be overthrown or destroyed. This is to offer their safety up to the chances which only heaven knows or guarantees, because when a people revolts, heaven knows the outcome, but nobody else does. And in that situation, heaven, or God as it were, approves of the rebellion, but does not guarantee that it will work. There's no doubt that God was in this way referring to the justice of the rebellion of 1688 and the Glorious Revolution against James II. And also perhaps he was referring to the rebellion against the Charles I, in which his father fought for the parliamentary forces. It's remarkable to me that he also makes few other historical references other than to William the Conqueror, saying that the rule of William I returned England to a state of nature and the people became slaves, but that it is possible after a conquest for the people willingly to submit to the new rule, and when they do so, that ruler ceases to be a tyrant and they cease to be slaves, which is what happened in England in that case over the decades which followed. I would say that this is how most civil governments are formed. An initial conquest is followed by a reasonable accommodation between the ruled and the ruler over a period of time. Now, I have spent 87 minutes reading this out, which is an hour and a half. And I have some conclusions which I would like to have made, which I'm not going to do. I've already referred frequently to Bertrand Russell and how I see his... It surprises me that Bertrand Russell was writing about Locke from the perspective of an international socialist rather than as a liberal, because Russell's grandfather was a liberal prime minister. Russell was upset by the idea that Britain needed to, in order to survive, needed to join an international government. He wasn't upset by that idea. In fact, he encouraged it. He encouraged Britain giving up its national sovereignty to belong to an international global government. He was saying this in 1944 with some reason, given that he was in a world war and that nuclear weapons were on the horizon. He also looks forward to a time when there'll be no property. For some reason which I can't work out, he then says Locke's political philosophy will become applicable. To my mind, Russell has no idea what Locke's philosophy is actually about. When you read the chapter in his History of Philosophy about Locke's political philosophy, it's hard to work out whether you're reading the same works as Russell read, because firstly, Russell did not understand what the law of nature means. Law of nature means the individual who has complete control over his life and does not have any other relationships with other people. This is the state of nature. So it is basically individualism. I don't think Russell understood that. The various other things which he didn't understand, due to his socialistic predispositions. And I think Locke made him angry because he could sense that Locke was a supreme individualist and that the people of his time were also individualists. Anyway, I was going to make some remarks about this, and I was also going to point out, only briefly, that there's a vast gap in Locke's political theory where organisation of the society and the rights and duties of people to the lower classes and so on should take place, which is the principal questions of our time. How shall we tax and how shall we redistribute the money? Locke's completely uninterested in that question. At that time, the government had enough money to raise an army, and that was it. And they could also, maybe some money was raised to see to law and order, but even that wasn't, spending wasn't delegated to that. It's as if with his Christian religion of absolute individualism, and with his social theory of absolute individualism, and loyalty to the notion of the nation, to the nation of England, which above all is the difference between the state of nature and the state of civil society, there is a huge space for a man to just do whatever he likes and to concentrate on working on his property. This space, you could then demand of us, well, what sort of moral reason was there for the government? And the answer is there's none. In order to live in a moral way, like an individual was expected to find his, once he's got his property and his family and he's made his obedience clear to the state, he is then free to look after his eternal soul and to be a Christian, and perhaps the church. The vast gap in the book regarding somebody's commitments to the various strata of society, particularly the poor, let's say, with which most post-1944 governments have been concerned, that was filled by the church. This is another reason why Bertrand Russell simply could not understand Locke's political theory. And with that, I'll end my reading. If you have any questions, you can always make comments underneath the video in the comments section. Also, it's quite typical for people to say that you can leave a like on this page, which increases the chances of me being seen by other people by the algorithm. Okay, thanks for listening.